Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for ISB's Research Roundtable. This is a series of talks to keep you up to date on our research. Our intention is to have one of these just about every month through the end of the year, so keep an eye out for our emails. Today we'll be hearing from our featured scientist, then there will be an opportunity for questions and answers after that. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you're welcome to submit questions at any time. I'll be monitoring those, and when Dr. Hood is done with his presentation, we'll move to the Q&A session and we'll work through those questions. Now I'd like to introduce another member of the ISB family, Carol Ellison. Carol serves on ISB's foundation board, which helps ISB raise philanthropic funding. Carol has been a volunteer and supporter of ISB for many years, and she's the generous supporter of 2 postdoctoral research fellows in Lee Hood's lab, known as the Ellison Fellows. She's an author and a poet. She's published a dozen books filled with inspiring poems. Please enjoy this video of Carol Ellison.
Hi, I'm Carol. Thanks, Renee. I'm delighted to have the honor of introducing our speaker today. Nearly 30 years ago, in the early 90s, I heard Dr. Lee Hood speak at the University of Washington. The topic was on the future of medicine. Dr. Hood is and was then a true visionary, and the information that he shared was all new to these ears. His mode of sharing that information with such joy and enthusiasm made the experience totally unforgettable. I have carried that memory with me for these 30 years. Now we fast forward to 2009. My husband, Bill, had died the previous year from complications due to Alzheimer's. My friend, Nick Newcomb, who at that time was working at ISB, called to tell me that ISB was doing research on Alzheimer's. He introduced me to both the institution and to its co-founder, Dr. Hood. Not surprising, I found Dr. Hood still as passionate about his work and about finding answers to questions as I had remembered. And he continues to think in terms of wellness as opposed to sickness. Passion is the key word here, I think, and that, along with his curiosity and ability to share the knowledge, is what in many ways defines Lee Hood. Passion enhances focus and keeps one on track to the solution. As I see it, Dr. Hood thinks in terms of solutions, not problems, and he remains passionate about sharing his information with others. He's a natural-born teacher. At this point, I'd like to read a quote of Lee's that has resonated deeply with me. And I quote, "Do not underestimate the power of your vision to change the world. Whether that world is your office, your community, an industry, or a global movement, you need to have a core belief that what you contribute can fundamentally change the paradigm or way of thinking about problems," end quote. Dr. Hood has contributed so much, and in so doing is changing the way of thinking about healthcare. He is recognized locally, nationally, and globally for his work. He has received many honors and prizes. Still, he continues to pursue excellence in all that he does. He is still curious. He is still looking for solutions. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Lee Hood.
Well, thank you, Carol, for that very gracious introduction. And I'll share my screen and get started with a new vision. So I'm going to talk to you today about Alzheimer's disease, and it will be to present a real paradigm change in the way we approach it. And I will emphasize that this paradigm change is not yet accepted by many physicians, but you can make your own mind up as we go through this. The essence of it is that we'll be able to predict, to prevent, and if you slip through and even get it at the early stage, reverse it. So let me tell you how I came to this. I share actually with Carol the tragedy of having a family member diagnosed with Alzheimer's, namely my wife, Valerie Logan Hood. I remember in 2004, Valerie came to me and said, I'd like to move from our beautiful home on Lake Washington, where frankly, I wanted to live for the rest of my life, to a downtown condo because I feel I can't manage this big, complex operation here. And it was just a few months later when in 2005, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And I must say, even being a physician and understanding Alzheimer's, I had very little idea about the enormous impact this would cause on the family. We did move to a condo downtown, and it was there I realized how much Valerie had changed, and the change is very slow. For example, in all our previous moves, Valerie had played a very dominant role in organizing and figuring out what they needed to do. Valerie, at this point in late 2005, was totally incapable of doing that. But what was interesting for the next 3 or 4 years, I think most people talking to her would have been hard pressed to say she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. But there was a slow incremental change in her memory, in her ability to deal with complexity and simple things like driving. I remember one of the critical crises in our marriage came when I had to take her car keys away because she'd been in several small accidents. And this was a loss of independence she found difficult to deal with. Valerie continued to slowly fade away. And in 2010 or so, started actually running away from home and requiring a lot more care than I could give her. So I hired a woman who's become a lifelong friend and in many ways a sister to Valerie, Jo Fiorito. And she and Valerie, for the next 5 years or so, I had just a delightful time together, singing and reading books and taking long walks and doing all the things that Valerie so loved. But Valerie's care moved to a requirement for 24-hour surveillance. And that was in 2015, we moved initially to Aegis at a memory floor. And it was a rich, musical, dancing, pleasurable kind of environment. But tragically, she in 2019 fell and broke a lumbar vertebrae and actually never walked again and even needed more intensive care. And we moved her finally to a small home that has taken care of her very well. And of course, this is what back in 2005 really set me on a trajectory that I'm going to tell you about now. But before I talk with Alzheimer's, let me give you my vision of what I think healthcare should be in the 21st century. And that is an N of one medicine where each individual has their health trajectory measured with a data-driven approach so as to optimize both for mind and body that trajectory. And what we'd like to be able to do is extend the wellness part of the trajectory And to deal with the wellness to disease transitions we all go through with very early diagnosis and reversal. And of course, we'd like to be able to deal with disease as well. And we'll tell you exactly how we plan to do that with Alzheimer's. Now, what about this data-driven health that I've talked about? It is going to be a key to dealing with Alzheimer's. And basically, we gather one's whole genome, we gather blood analytes, proteins and metabolites and clinical chemistries. We gather the gut microbiome and do that several times a year, and then have a digital device like the Fitbit and the Oura Ring to be able to monitor ordinary physiology, and that generates data unique for each individual that can be analyzed to identify which of many actionable possibilities they can use to improve their wellness. So the genome is, of course, analyzing your genome. The phenome is all the rest of the measurements. It's the blood and the microbiome and the digital measurements and everything. And what we need to do is measure the phenome in a longitudinal manner so we can see how you change with time. And we've done that with two different experiments, pioneering experiment in 2014, and then the next year starting Arvale that brought scientific wellness to consumers using this data-driven approach and gathered 5,000 consumers. And each of them had their data cloud, which gave us deep fundamental insights into new aspects of biology. And I'll talk about those as we go through. So AD, Alzheimer's disease, what about its history and its status? So these are kind of key points for understanding what the status quo is and the direction in which we're going. What was really remarkable is about 10 or 12 years ago, a friend of mine at UCLA, Mike Phelps, who invented PET scanning, used that technology, metabolic PET scanning, to determine that you could actually diagnose Alzheimer's for 4 to 12 years before the first clinical signs ever came. And that's remarkable. So that means the disease has been going on for an average of 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years before you even see the disease. So that was one thing we had to change to get an early diagnosis that wasn't very expensive and complicated and needed to use radioactive materials. Number two, at 2005 really did a thorough survey of the drugs that were available, and it was clear they were totally ineffective, and maybe they had temporary treatment. I'm not completely convinced of that, but they certainly didn't have long-term effects. And this is one thing I argued with Valery's internist about. I argued we should get rid of these drugs years after a year or two when it was obvious they were doing absolutely nothing. And she argued against it. And I'll tell you later what happened in that regard when I finally put my foot down and did get rid of the drugs. Today, there are more than 500 consecutive clinical trials for Alzheimer's that have failed. That is, there isn't a single drug. And what that means is the classic traditional approach to Alzheimer's isn't working at all. And we have to think about it in brand new ways. There are multiple subtypes of Alzheimer's, probably 4 or 5 at least, but they can come about as a consequence of primarily being driven by inflammation. A striking example is black mold, which comes about often if you have a leak in your roof. You don't know it, you breathe it for a year or for 5 years, And what is remarkable with the approach I'm going to talk about is if you move these people at an early stage out of their mold-ridden homes, they can recover quite rapidly and move back to normal. And a very common cause of Alzheimer's are little micro clots that occur in the brain, microinfarctions that go on as we age, and that can lead to a vascular form of Alzheimer's disease. There is one dominant gene called ApoE4 that if you have two bad copies of the gene, by the time you're 65, you have an increased chance of Alzheimer's that's 60% greater than normal. And if you add one bad copy, it's about 12% greater than normal. And it's much more severe in these numbers for women than men for reasons we don't understand at this point in time. And that was when a former student of mine at Caltech, who went on to get an MD and get very interested in Alzheimer's, decided he'd take a systems approach to it. And his idea was, what are the things we can do to optimize synaptic communication, which is one of the things we lose in Alzheimer's. And he came up with a multimodal therapy of 36 points. And these included lifestyle, exercise, sleep, diet, supplements, drugs, avoidance of environmental toxins, and all the like. And his initial very casual results on about 100 patients were there was a remarkable tendency to move at least the early stage individuals to a normal level if you could persuade them to carry out the major lifestyle changes. And that, of course, is always the challenge for therapies. What happened about 8 years ago was a clinical trial came along that supported this approach beautifully, called the Finger clinical trial in Finland. And it actually studied lifestyle changes to deal with neurodegenerative diseases. And the results were really quite strikingly supportive of the fact that these neurodegenerative diseases have an enormously important component that has to do with lifestyle changes. We're now putting together an observational clinical trial using the Genome Phenome data clouds I described for you earlier in very high-risk patients to be able to follow those at an appropriate age in the 50s and 60s to see the transition point at which they move from wellness to disease, and to get a biomarker marking that transition point, presumably 4 to 10 years prior to any clinical diagnosis. And this kind of biomarker will be a godsend for Alzheimer's in the future, a very simple kind of blood test once we get it. We're also setting up a series of 3 clinical trials to use various combinations of this clinical multimodal therapy to optimize which of the 36 elements are really the most important for this. The financial consequences of Alzheimer's are really striking. We have today about almost 6 million with Alzheimer's in the US. The annual cost is $600 billion, near over $500 billion. And half of it goes for treatment of the affected individuals, and half of it goes for the loss of caretaker wages. And I'll tell you, this is where I'll tell you a story that drove home the enormous impact Alzheimer's has on families. I went to an evening session with 11 other people who were caretakers for Alzheimer's individuals. And we went around the table and talked about our experiences and our feelings about the whole experience. And what was striking was 6 of the 12 said almost exactly the same thing. I just want it to be over. I can't live like this. We're spending all our money. We're not going to have anything left at the end. And it was horrible. And it was just so heartbreaking to hear these people that were average income people just crying to have this thing be over in spite of their love and their willingness to be a caretaker and everything. And Alzheimer's is a disease that conveys a gradual descent into silence, into a loss of recognition and cognition, and then finally, ultimately, obviously, to death, with an enormous impact over the family. And it can go anywhere from just a few years on a rapid course to 15 or more years, as has been the case with Valerie so far. So the big idea is threefold. Number one, we want to carry out this clinical trial so we'll have a simple blood assay that can be used, say, on a yearly basis once you get to your 40s or 50s to identify the earliest transition point for your disease. Because at that earliest transition point, using the multimodal therapies for prevention is much easier than when the disease gets later, because the complexity of the disease is far less. So prediction and prevention is really key for Alzheimer's. And we think within a 4 or 5 year period, we'll be in a wonderful position to be able to use both of these strategies. I will say with some of Dale Bredesen's early clinical results, not standard clinical trials, but observational trials, we think that the multimodal therapies will indeed be able to reverse early stage Alzheimer's disease. And my hope is that in a period of 10 years or so, we'll be able to deal with more than 80% of the Alzheimer's that we now have facing us. And of course, then the ultimate would be to scale it to the US and then to developed countries and finally across the world. And we think as time passes, we'll become more and more effective both at diagnosis or prediction and at prevention. Now, ISB is really unique in that it has absolutely phenomenal technologies to be able to deal with Alzheimer's. And I've already talked about the first two, that is the personal data clouds and the multimodal therapies. But I will point out a couple of other things, not going through the entire list. There is something called a frailty index that gives you a marvelous measure of increasing fragility, decreasing resilience. And we can use that in clinical trials to assess both the rapidity and the extent of the change that's occurring. And in fact, we think we're going to be getting a faculty member from Harvard that is an expert in this particular area. And I'll say also, we're just beginning to work on an AI approach to Alzheimer's, which I'm going to describe in a really simplistic way. And that is, the idea we have is to be able to create a data lake into which we can put everything we know about diagnosis, about therapy, and prognosis, and that we can use that lake to be able to take the data from an individual patient and place it in that context and have feed out from that lake the diagnosis, the suggested therapies, and a prediction of what's going to happen and the rate at which it will happen. And if we succeed with this AI approach to Alzheimer's, the exciting idea is we can do it at a distance, and we can make a GP in Walla Walla, Washington, equivalent to the world's best diagnostic expert for Alzheimer's in big clinical centers. So we can democratize the whole idea of how we deal with this disease. I will say, with regard to genetic risk and ApoE4, my family had its ApoE4 alleles determined. My wife and I each had one bad copy. And even one bad copy for a woman is, as I said, much worse than for a man. And our children, Marquis, a daughter, had no copies, and Erin had two bad copies. So with Marquis, she had gotten really depressed during the last year or so of Valerie's progression, because she was worried because Valerie's mother had Alzheimer's, Valerie had Alzheimer's, and Marquis was convinced she was going to get Alzheimer's. So knowing that she didn't have the highest risk gene just changed her life in a remarkable way. My son, on the other hand, has been working with Mary Kay Ross, who is an expert in multimodal therapy and running the brain health and research clinic that ISB is sponsored here in Seattle. And she has given him preventive recommendations that should delay permanently, if not very long term, any transition to Alzheimer's. And he's undergone the lifestyle changes that are compatible with that. So the point is, there are things you can do about Alzheimer's now, and you should find out about them if you are dealing with a loved one that needs help. There are other fascinating clinical opportunities. We will be able to use the data clouds to be able to subtype the various forms of Alzheimer's disease. And this, of course, will allow us to optimize the multimodal therapy for each type and know exactly how to deal with it at a very early stage. In families with the ApoE4 status, I think it's essential that that be analyzed to determine whether that is a factor in the Alzheimer's that you have. And then finally, we have some really promising results with regard to multimodal therapies working on several other neurodegenerative diseases, including one form of Parkinson's, ALS, and frontal temporal dementia. So the vision is we could, in the future, perhaps with this lifestyle drug supplement approach, be able to deal with many chronic neurodegenerative diseases, especially if we do this diagnostic work to get blood markers that will give us the earliest warning for reversal and so forth. So the grand vision that is to predict, to prevent, and if you have it, to reverse it, at least in early stage. And I think this is something that will be coming in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think there's reason to be very optimistic. And I think this is something that could easily scale to the developed world and finally the entire world in the future. So with that, I think I'll stop sharing the screen and we can open it up for questions if there are questions.
Hi, Lee. We do have some questions. So let's start with that first one. And by the way, there's that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. That's a great place to start posting your questions. So the first question is, it's actually about what's the difference between, let's see, Dr. Hood, are you equating dementia with Alzheimer's? The Alzheimer's Association defines dementia as a generic term, with Alzheimer's causing about 70% of all cases of dementia.
That's exactly how I would define it. I think dementia is the general term, and it includes all of the many different neurodegenerative diseases. Alzheimer's is certainly the major disease in
Okay.
this regard.
Great, thank you. And then of course, we always have a number of questions about after a talk like this. What can I do if starting at 5:01 when we're done here? What are the top 3 things that I can do to prevent Alzheimer's?
You know, I think the top 3 things really are lifestyle. So I would say diet is incredibly important. I would say exercise is incredibly important. And I would say adequate sleep is incredibly important. And if you're interested in learning more about these things, as I said, Mary Kay Ross runs the brain research, brain health clinic and research institute that is on Mercer, I think.
Uh-huh.
And you could meet with her or someone like that to gain information. And of course, if you have someone that's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, particularly at the early stage, you talking with someone who knows about how to deal with multimodal therapy is important. I will say there are functional physicians that have actually learned this too. So there are a number of different sources that one could go through. But I think learning from these people the lifestyle changes that are going to be most powerful and effective, and exercise and diet and all the rest is really a key point. And you can make a big difference. And I would suggest that really what all of us want to do is what I call scientific wellness. Optimize your wellness and make yourself as healthy as you possibly can. And that's going to be key. I will say another area that's become very hot recently is healthy aging. And in fact, we had a town hall last week, a conversation with David Sinclair, who's one of the leading experts in this area. And he made some very good suggestions about how to optimize your healthy aging. And I think you can get from ISB the video and look at it if you're interested in that. But the important point that he made is really aging is a disease and we can do something about it. And aging is the major causative factor for virtually every chronic disease, including Alzheimer's, frankly. And so if you can slow your aging down, you can have an enormous impact on your transitions into chronic diseases. So that is another thing to think about.
Right. Well, and since you brought it up, you can see that video of you with David Sinclair, and it is on our website, isbscience.org. And if you go to our events tab, we have the current events coming up. And if you scroll down a little bit, we actually have almost a year's worth of archived videos. So there's the video of you talking to Dr. Fauci about COVID. There's, you with David Sinclair last week. There was Sean Gibbons about the microbiome. So it's kind of a treasure trove of interesting topics. So I would encourage everyone to go there. Okay, next question. If you are curious about your APO status, how can you simply go to your GP and get this tested? Do you need to have a reason to suspect it to get the genetic test ordered?
You can order the genetic test from a number of different places. You don't need, I mean, your physician may have reservations. There are people who believe, knowing bad things, we should never give patients bad news. My feeling is patients should know what they are and be prepared to deal with what they are. And if you have ApoE4, as I said, there are many things you can do to deal with that, and you certainly should. So, so there are many different places you can get it. And if you want, you can send, if you're interested in this, send Renee an email, and I'll get a couple of places that I can give her that she can suggest that you could order this test if
Okay.
you wish. Okay. I don't have those in my head right now.
Okay. And so kind of on that note, are there any supplements that have proven benefit for brain health?
Well, one of the really interesting things is the analogy that Dale Bredesen used, which was really a wonderful one, is he said your brain is exactly like a big building, and it can have up to 36 different holes in it, one for each of the actionable possibilities. And many of those are supplements, okay? So what you have to do is analyze for those supplements. And if you're deficient, replace them. And yes, there are many supplements that are used with regard to Alzheimer's disease. And again, if you're really interested in this, Dale Bredesen wrote a book called The End of Alzheimer's, which was enormously controversial, but it was a New York Times bestseller for 2 or 3 years. And you can get that book and read it, and he goes into detail on the details of all of the 36 elements and what they've done in the supplements and all those. But the key point is to find out if you're deficient. You don't need them if you have sufficient amounts, but you do if you are deficient. And I'll tell you one thing that almost everyone is deficient in, especially in Seattle, is vitamin D. And vitamin D deficiency is a predisposing factor for Alzheimer's. So that is an example of a vitamin that you should certainly be certain you're at normal levels for.
Okay, great. Here's a question. Do the treatment lifestyle approaches differ much depending on the cause of your Alzheimer's? If you have a different cause, do you need a different treatment?
So the answer is yes. For example, if you have Alzheimer's that's been generated by black mold, you have to get out of the black mold environment. And for many people, that means moving, because getting rid of black mold, once it's really in your house, your apartment, your condo, wherever, is very difficult to do. And that, if it's very early, can almost be sufficient in reversing things. On the inflammation side of things, there are supplements that you can use to bring down inflammation in striking ways, and they obviously can be beneficial in that regard. On the micro infarctions, on the little vascular clots that have formed in the brain, the critical thing is to make sure your blood pressure is normal. I mean, anybody beyond 40s or 50s ought to really go for a normal blood pressure. The higher you push it up, the more likely you are to have these little infarctions that end up leading to something bad for your brain. Whether it's just, it may not end up being Alzheimer's, it may end up being something else, but you don't want high blood pressure.
So I know last week when you were talking to David Sinclair, you seemed really intrigued about the intermittent fasting.
Well, David he argued passionately that intermittent fasting is one of the most effective things you can do to slow down the aging process. And of course, I do agree with him. I do intermittent fasting now, and I think it's good for clarity of thought. It's certainly good for weight, and it certainly keeps, I think, a lot of the blood chemistries normal as you age. So I think fasting is one very powerful tool.
What kind do you do? What does your intermittent fasting look like, Lee?
So typically what I'll do is eat dinner and then not eat again, and either until lunch the next day. So that's a 16-hour fast or so. Or sometimes I'll go till dinner the next day, and that's roughly a 24-hour fast. There are people who argue you can even get more cleansing activity, if you will, with 2-day or 3-day or 4-day fasts. Those are challenging for most people. And I haven't even tried one. A day is fine with me.
Okay. Fair enough. Do you think there will be one blood biomarker for predicting Alzheimer's disease onset, or will it be sets of biomarkers which will help stratify patients based on type?
It'll be sets, and it will stratify them at the same time. It will not only diagnose that you've transitioned to Alzheimer's, it will tell you what subtype you get. And I would guess we generally shoot for anywhere between 2 or 3 and 6 or 8 proteins. And usually those are more than sufficient to do the diagnosis.
Okay. Here's a question about what is ISB discovering so far in its clinical trials for Alzheimer's? This person's looking for kind of an insider's look. I know we're still working on those, but how are things shaping up?
Well, 2 of the trials are just getting started, so we can say almost nothing about those. The third trial is a relatively small one, and one of the things that it actually tested was a multimodal component that optimized brain cognition called Brain HQ. And some of the preliminary results there look very promising. And Brain HQ is basically a whole series of games that you can play on your computer, and the games speak to various major cognitive elements like reaction speed, depth of field, memory, and things like that. So you can have games that improve all of these kind of things. And what Brain HQ has had is probably by now 300 or 400 clinical trials, and a number of them demonstrated beautifully. For example, one clinical trial was done in people with very high risk for Alzheimer's and demonstrated beautifully. The control group compared against the experimental group that played Brain HQ suffered much more transition to Alzheimer's than the experimental group did. So I think there is evidence that cognitive exercise, just like body exercise, can play an important role in keeping you healthy and aging slowly and away from Alzheimer's.
Okay, this is a great question to kind of follow up right up on that. Our approach is a departure from the Alzheimer's research of the past 20 years. You know, it's been so focused, as you said, on drugs.
Right.
What are the hurdles when it comes to getting traditional Alzheimer's specialists on board with the way that we're doing it?
The hurdles are utterly staggering because there is enormous skepticism out there. And I think the key are really good, powerful clinical trials that prove the point. And we're trying to do those now. I think that's all you can do. I mean, Dale Bredesen, I think, was a real genius to come up with this systems approach, but I will criticize him because he could have done some early, really important clinical trials with proper controls and all those things. He never did. He just did kind of the observational trials and maybe even did a bit of cherry picking and everything. But nonetheless, with his results, I'm convinced that is going to be the answer. And what we have to do is to have bona fide clinical trials that approve it. And I think this finger trial that I mentioned took a big step in that direction. So I think we'll have really good data in a couple of years that will start to turn people around. And look, people are slowly coming to the realization that all the things they thought were going to work didn't work. So they need to do something else. Now it's just a matter of convincing them that something else isn't going to be just one drug, that most chronic diseases are lifestyle diseases. They aren't single little elements you can fix with a drug.
Okay, that's great. And you've mentioned Dale Bredesen a number of times, and I'm going to circle back a little bit because he is controversial. And I know that I know for a fact there are some people on this call who are, going to ask that question. So, so you talked about how he basically didn't do the kind of trials that we're doing now around the multimodal. Is that what was controversial about him and his work, or?
Yeah, I mean, he wrote the book and he made the claims, but he didn't have a clinical trial to back them up.
Okay.
And of course, I've given you all of this talk without the proper clinical trials to back us up, but we're doing them, so we'll know them.
Yeah, they're
and as I said, from the one small trial we started first, I
Mhm.
think the results look very encouraging.
Okay, great, thank you. What is your take on viral causation of Alzheimer's disease?
Well, this is an enormously interesting area. But I will say it is really difficult to prove. So, there are a number of, for example, people have been trying to prove that glioblastoma, a brain cancer, is actually caused by a virus. And one would think that that's easy to do, but it isn't, because there's lots of contamination and lots of related viruses that are present in bodies and things like this. So it's a hard hypothesis to formulate. But again, I think Alzheimer's is generally not going to have just one cause. I think it's going to be a multiple cascade of things that are going wrong that end up causing it. Now, the one exception, which is pretty striking, are the environmental toxins, the black mold example that I gave you. I mean, there are examples where patients literally got cured by moving them out of their house for 6 months and getting rid of all of that black mold and seeing them is flip back to normal.
So your black mold comment did kind of pique some interest here, and the follow-up question was, is the black mold actually causing Alzheimer's or dementia?
Well, what it causes is indistinguishable from what people call Alzheimer's. It certainly causes dementia. I mean, dementia is the classification for any neurodegenerative diseases, but the black mold Alzheimer's patients fit all the criteria for Alzheimer's.
Okay, I'm looking through. I think let me see, make sure I got everything here. Okay, one last question. Any backstory on the Golden Gate Bridge behind you?
Yes, it's an aspiration and not a reality. And that's what this talk is. An aspiration and not quite a reality, but I'm going to make it a reality.
I don't think anyone doubts you, Lee. Well, thank you very much, Lee. Thanks for joining us today. This was really helpful.
Okay, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Good questions.
Yeah. This was a robust group. Good. They're really involved today. And I also want to thank Carol Ellison for welcoming you. She's a big fan of yours. And so
and I want to thank her too for a most gracious introduction.
Yeah, it was great. It was from the heart. It was lovely.
Yes.
And we do have another one of these events coming up, and the next one is Tuesday, May 18th at 4 p.m. And you can join ISB Senior Research Scientist Jared Roach for a discussion on the Coaching for Cognition in Alzheimer's trial. So that's a good way. If the trials around Alzheimer's piqued your interest today, then you can dig a little bit more deeply into that with Jared on May 18th. So yeah, that's about all we have today. Hopefully you're on our email list. And if not, you can always go to the events tab on our website and register for any one of these events. And we're going to have these, we're going to be listing more as we go. So stay tuned. And that's all we have for today. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Lee. Have a wonderful evening.
Same to all of you.